So hello all and welcome. My name is Sequoyah de Souza and I'll be chairing tonight's event entitled NATO, Ukraine and Russia, War, Propaganda and Censorship. Please note that this is being recorded and it's also being live streamed on No Cold War's YouTube channel. The event has been organised by No Cold War Britain, British group of the International No Cold War campaign, which was set up to oppose the new Cold War. The social media channels and website are being put into the chat function, so please give them a follow to stay up to date. No Cold War has also put out 2 statements on the situation in Ukraine, which are also going to be put into the chat, and I'd encourage you all to sign it. One of them is on ending the war in Ukraine and constructing a lasting peace, and the other on NATO's eastward expansion. In terms of the format of the event, it is due to run for an hour and a half till around 8:30, which includes around an hour of speaker contributions, followed by Q&As. And we're very pleased to have a great mix of international and British-based speakers: Andrew Feinstein, Camila Escalante, Asa Winstanley, Chen, Kayla Quesada, and Steve Sweeney. The speakers' social media info will also be put into the chat for you to follow their output. And in terms of the Q&As, I would encourage you to put questions in the question and answer function, which should be at the bottom bar next to the chat function. And a selection of those will be put to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end. Now, before I introduce the first speaker, I'll just make a couple of brief remarks. As someone speaking from Britain, a key NATO member, we have to be aware of our political responsibility to hold our own government to account. Because, to put it very mildly, there are question marks over whether Western media is willing to do it itself. Now, NATO continues to escalate its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine by sending tens of billions worth of weapons into the war zone. Simultaneously, voices in support of dialogue and negotiations, or those who simply question the dominant NATO-friendly narratives, are becoming increasingly censored and silenced. Indeed, the Western media's coverage of the conflict in Ukraine has been characterised by a narrow consensus of reporting, which significantly distorts and overlooks the geopolitical and historical context, and largely ignores alternative voices. NATO's moves to escalate the war are given unquestioning support. Dissenting and critical views are smeared, and governments and social media platforms have banned and stifled many independent commentators and alternative media. With NATO's dangerous escalation threatening to prolong the war in Ukraine and increase the suffering of Ukrainian people, it is urgent that we engage in balanced and broad public debate, dialogue and discussion on the path towards de-escalation and peace. To this end, we will explore a variety of questions, including the scale of the West's attack on free speech, plurality and debate. What are the dangers of the climate of censorship? Why is there an attempt to shut down alternative media platforms, including Russia Today, CGTN, and other alternative voices on social media in the West? And it's worth noting on this, they've even banned tennis players, prospective students, and on the more surreal and bizarre end of the spectrum, cats and even trees. And also we have to consider NATO's aggressive eastward expansion, the growth of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, the US-backed coup in Ukraine of 2014, the 8-year civil war in the east of Ukraine, and the real global consequences of the West's sanctions against Russia. And ask, what is the mainstream Western media not telling us about the war in Ukraine and why? And while poverty and inequality increase in the US and Britain, does pumping billions of pounds of weapons into the conflict help or hinder the road to peace, and who benefits? And finally, why are voices from the global south being excluded from the public debate on the war in Ukraine? To help us shed light on some of these pressing points, we are delighted to introduce our first speaker, author, campaigner, and former African National Congress MP, Andrew Feinstein. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Thanks so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with you tonight. So, I mean, as you suggest in your introductory remarks, the starting point for me is that in any situation of conflict, in any situation leading to conflict, there is no nuance. The world has to be understood in black and white. There has to be a Manichean vision of the world in which there is only good and evil. There is no conflict that has been, there is no conflict that will be, in which there is not nuance. And our media is the epicenter of the complete lack or loss of clear thinking, of analysis, of nuance, and of meaningful interpretation of what is going on. So I want to cover a few things coming out of my research that are not covered in the Western media. The first is that this conflict, like any conflict, is a profound failure of diplomacy. And lest we forget, for if we read only the traditional media, we may well, NATO is a military alliance, not a diplomatic alliance. When a committee was established for the expansion of NATO at the conclusion of the Cold War, who chaired that committee? A senior vice president of Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons maker on the planet. And his pitch to countries looking to accede to NATO membership was simple. You spend however many million, tens of billions of dollars on American weapons, and America will support your candidacy for NATO. I've documented in detail in my book, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, how this worked and the sorts of stratospheric amounts of money that American defense companies made from it. It is also worth bearing in mind that the United States of America, which produces 40% of the world's armaments, employs more people to run and maintain a single aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. Today, the United States of America has 11 aircraft carriers and is about to commission its 12th. So when you have a sphere of the world that is focused totally on making war, and I'll come to the reasons for that in a moment, it is inevitable that conflict predominates over peace. When the Western world perceives the entire globe through what the philosopher C. Wright Mills described as a militarist mindset, it is inevitable that conflict will take preponderance over diplomacy and peace. I think what is also really important, before I get to the finances, the corruption, to bear in mind the sort of response we see in the traditional media to the conflict in the Ukraine by comparison to the conflict in Yemen or the conflict in Palestine. In each of those cases, in the case of Yemen, for over 7 years now, it is Western weapons and Western diplomatic cover and support for the Saudi and UAE-led coalition that has led to the deaths of over 377,000 Yemenis, that has led to the worst humanitarian crisis of at least this past century. This is being done with our weapons, with our diplomatic support, and the atrocities that are being committed on a daily basis against the people of Yemen are unfortunately even worse than those that are being committed in the Ukraine. But we see and hear nothing about that. In Palestine, similarly, our own weapons, our alliance with Israel, which is both at the level of producing arms together, as well as at the level of almost total diplomatic support and cover. The ongoing system of apartheid in Israel itself and the brutal and illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories continues apace with barely a murmur from our media. Why is this so often the case in addition to the obvious geopolitical motivations? Well, the sad reality is that in any conflict, there are many on all sides who profit materially at obscene levels. Within hours of the invasion of the Ukraine, defense company shares increased by on average 26%. In the case of some, like Lockheed Martin and others, that increase went over 40% as the conflict intensified. Regulation of arms exports and accountability for arms sales, which is appalling all of the time, at times of conflict, disappear entirely. Let us bear in mind that the trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. And crucially, that corruption plays an extremely important role in funding our political systems in the United States of America, where it is a form of what I describe as legalized bribery, in the United Kingdom and the countries of Europe, where it is in theory illegal, but happens constantly and continuously. The trade in weapons also operates in its own legal universe with virtual impunity. When I wrote the first edition of The Shadow World in late 2011, we recorded 502 violations of UN arms embargoes. 2 of those had led to any form of legal accountability. 1 had led to a conviction in which an arms dealer who had made profits of around $158 million on an embargoed arms deal was fined what he described to me as pocket change. The same is happening now in the conflict in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military and defense sector, much like the Russian military and defense sector, is dominated by corruption. The main beneficiaries of that corruption, besides the executives of the arms companies, are politicians and political parties. However, we will only be able to fully investigate and reveal this corruption retrospectively post the conflict. And of course, many of these players are arming both sides in this conflict, as they so often do. Since at least 2010, Britain has been supplying Russia with a wide variety of armaments. That slowed down only slightly post-2014, when certain specific restrictions were brought into place. Of course, we barely have to pause to think about the extent of funding by Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs of the ruling Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, and how bizarrely the list of those sanctioned conveniently excluded the biggest political donors from Russia in this instance. Finally, let me say that to keep defense budgets at their completely inexplicable and obscene levels, we need enemies. So we need conflicts like we're witnessing in the Ukraine at the moment to be able to justify the completely unjustifiable levels of defense spending in the world. In the United Kingdom, as the COVID-19 virus hit, when we were unable to provide frontline healthcare workers with basic masks and gloves to protect them, we increased our defense budget by over £17 billion, an amount that the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, my own member of parliament, called inadequate. So long as our approach to defense, to the military, is structured as it is, so long as the trade in weapons enables and facilitates our corrupt and dysfunctional politics, conflict and the trade in arms will continue to make us more corrupt, poorer, far less democratic, and most tragic of all, far less safe. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andrew. Timely, important, insightful, and information rich as always, and kept to time, no less. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Camila Escalante, a journalist and presenter all the way from South America, and we're very happy and intrigued to listen to her contribution. Over to you, Camila.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me. Thank you to No Cold War Britain. I think the work that you guys do is incredibly important. And I really mean that, because I have been very critical in my own household and workplace with the British people who are around me about the positions that I've heard coming from the UK in particular. It's very disturbing, and I've been on some Zoom panels where we were there to speak about solidarity with Latin America, solidarity with the global South, and what are the things, some of the things we can do from the global North, from the UK, to support the revolutionary processes of the global South. But unfortunately, a lot of people coming from these sort of labor circles were very quick from the outset to come out and condemn the president of Russia and condemn Russia for its actions without doing what Sequoyah and Andrew said here in the beginning, which is look at the ways to hold their own country responsible and their own, the UK regime of Boris Johnson, as well as the regimes that are all a part of NATO. And that's, of course, the responsibility of the citizens of the global South and of those NATO countries, is to look and see what they can be doing to mobilize from home. There's no solidarity in the global South or in the North with the South and our causes and our revolutionary processes if you're not listening to what the demands are. The demands of people like Hugo Chavez, Commander Hugo Chavez behind me, and of the president of the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism here in Bolivia, Evo Morales, who's the president of this union. Their demands are actually, and have been, to disband NATO. Their demands have always been to stop war. And they have said that all wars are rooted in imperialism and in NATO aggression towards other countries. And they are wars for resources, wars for control of territory. And there are wars that seek to displace us and of course, exploit our labor and continue this, this death cycle that is imperialism. So I want to talk a little bit in the short time I have about how censorship and propaganda is related to our region, Latin America. So I'm here at the headquarters of the 6 federations of the Tropico of Cochabamba. This is a very important union, and Evo Morales is of course the president of this union, and we have a radio station here in the rural area of Bolivia. The whole reason why Evo and the union decided that they needed to have their own media outlet here in Bolivia is because of the very things we saw during the coup. Leading up to the coup that took place here in Bolivia in 2019, in which we saw a break with the constitutional order, we saw an illegal coup in which a senator, little known, absolutely unknown to the international world, swore herself in as president with the help of the military and the police. And leading up to the coup, the entire process of delegitimizing Evo, delegitimizing this revolutionary process, the democratic and cultural revolution that took place here, led by Evo Morales, we saw the oligarchy-controlled media completely spit out lies and feed lies to the international media as well, that were making all sorts of fabrications about issues related to the environment, related to nature and indigenous rights, about the healthcare sector. Some of the right-wing doctors were actually protesting against the government, and this is of course all because they want a return. They wanted a return to the colonial times here in Latin America, as is the case in all countries. That is what the right wing, seeks to do, is take us back to colonial times and domination from the North, from the United States, from Washington, where they want us to take orders from. And of course, this is a revolutionary process that is working towards the opposite. Evo Morales got tired of the lies of the mainstream media and said, community radio stations need to be launched. We need to have control of our own narrative, and we need to build our own platforms. So this was incredibly important during the coup, of course, because we saw that they. Oh, I think I'm seeing.
Asa, could you unshare, please? Thanks.
We saw that during the coup, they actually went and ransacked all of the media outlets and started putting in their own presenters, their own management, and everything like that, so that they could, manipulate the narrative. Now, Radio Kawsachun Koga and Kawsachun News just the same. Within the context of the conflict overseas, what's really important is that we're sharing news from the perspectives from the South, the perspectives from Latin America, listening to our own analysts here from Bolivia, our own political analysts, our own political scientists, our own experts, and we're able to turn on the radio and hear from sound bites from President Maduro, from President Daniel Ortega, Diaz-Canel, and from Latin American political thought. And going back to years since the creation of NATO, we began to see, these very sharp critiques about why it existed and why it was created, from Fidel Castro and then from Comandante Hugo Chavez. And this was extremely important. I think it's very important for people in the North to know that here, for anyone paying attention here, in these populations, among the unions and among the leftist parties, people don't follow the same line as we see on CNN and all the major news networks. And, and we don't believe in the same things as everyone else believes in the North. There's a fundamental, huge difference. And so, one of the reasons why we exist is, of course, to show the alternatives to capitalism. We're not just saying we're against capitalism. We're actually saying we're for socialism, and a very specific type of socialism. But we also are against, this proliferation and dissemination of absolutely fake news that doesn't in any way whatsoever represent the realities here. We experienced censorship way before the start of this conflict, as Telesur, obviously RT and Press TV also experienced really heavy censorship on YouTube and Twitter and other platforms. And we saw the suspension of government authorities. President Trump, the president of the United States, was not the first president or the first important authority to be censored on Twitter. Actually, that happened to a lot of Cuban and Venezuelan authorities beforehand. And so I think, some of the things that Evo and some of the leaders here, of course, of the MAS and President Luis Arce's government have highlighted is the absurdity of being accused from the North of having the accusations here of our governments supporting Russia and providing all of that support for Russia and propping up Russia in this conflict, when the fact is that our economies are so small and we haven't sent a single weapon, we haven't sent a penny to Russia or any European nation, while the countries of the global North, specifically the United States, Canada, and all other NATO countries, are required to spend a certain amount of their GDP per year on defense. And defense spending obviously is not defense, it's on war. They're spending money on war and they're spending it by the billions. And more is being demanded every single week. As a Canadian citizen myself, of course, I've lived in other global North countries. It's absurd that there are people living in poverty who are dying out in the street in the cold during the winter, and all sorts of other issues having to do with inequality and discrimination within these societies. And they are sending money and weapons by the billions and pledging more and more and asking more of the people. This is money that should be spent on social programs and improving the lives of the poorest and bridging the inequality gap, something that we are doing here, that the government of Bolivia and other socialist governments are doing here. At the same time, I know I have few seconds, but I just want to, say that what's going on right now in the context of the Summit of the Americas and the run up to this sham summit that's going to be taking place in Los Angeles, in the United States, we are seeing the outright rejection of this summit and of the way it's so exclusionary. And of course, it's just a US OAS summit, that's just being run by Luis Almagro and Joe Biden's friends. And we are seeing the rejection of that from the Caribbean. As it's not just these socialist governments of Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia, and Venezuela. It's also the Caribbean countries right now who, since last year, the last couple of years, since Barbados decided that they wanted to be independent from the UK crown and they don't want to be a monarchy anymore. Now, all of the other countries in the Commonwealth are speaking about this same issue as well. It's extremely important, and independent of Alba and Venezuela and the influence and the friendship they might have with Cuba, they are demanding more respect for sovereignty, more respect for their independence. And these movements are taking place at the same time as they are very resentful for the way in which they're going to be,
Camila, please.
In the way in which that they're going to be affected by all of these changes in prices and the fluctuations internationally that affect the citizens of their own countries due to this war that they have nothing to do with and they want nothing to do with. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Camila. It's essential to get views from the global south, and also fascinating and interesting points there. And it's worth remembering, of course, that the global south constitutes the majority of humanity. And just on that point, we're told the world is with NATO and supports sanctions. But in fact, 15% of the global population make up the countries who are sanctioning Russia, yet 85% of the population do not, but their views are ignored. And just to say, it's perhaps timely and relevant that Hugo Chavez was in the background there, because he once said that fascists are not human, a snake is more human. And I think fascism and neo-Nazism is going to be one of the topics that's discussed by our next speaker, who is Asa Winstanley, a journalist and political commentator. So over to you, Asa.
Well, thanks for having me. I want to talk about a couple of things briefly. I want to really back up what Camila said about censorship of media from the global south. So I want to talk about censorship, but I also want to talk about NATO and NATO's current and historic backing for extreme neo-Nazis, Nazis, neo-Nazis, and fascists. So we're in the title of this group in the seminar is No to a New Cold War. But, it seems to me that we are kind of in a new Cold War against Russia, against China. And it's a really kind of frightening McCarthyist phase we're entering, where there's all kinds of censorship and by the tech giants, by the imperialist states in the West. And it, first and foremost, it affects people, as was said by Camila, in the global south. We see journalists, Russian journalists, Iranian journalists in Bolivia being censored, having outlets like Press TV, RT, and Palestinian journalists especially censored by the tech giants. I experienced that in a very small way myself in March, and I'm going to try and share my screen here. Apologies for the little misstep earlier. It's the first time I've done this, so bear with me. So hopefully, can you see this tweet?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I shared this tweet. I posted this tweet. Well, I attempted to post this tweet to my Twitter in March, and it was instantly deleted by a Twitter's automated robots. And you can see here that I was criticizing these, I posted these images. So this, NATO's official Twitter account had posted this tweet for International Women's Day, where they were trying to kind of, I guess you could say, feminist wash NATO. and the involvement of NATO in Ukraine by posting, female Ukrainian soldiers. Well, one of them, as many people pointed out on Twitter, this woman here, if you zoom in closer, you can see that on her body armor was this symbol, the black sun, which is a Nazi symbol used by neo-Nazis. And in this photo here, on the top right, you can see this was the body armor used by Brenton Tarrant, who was the mass murderer in New Zealand in 2019. And so I posted this tweet criticizing the hypocrisy of NATO ostensibly standing up for freedom, but actually promoting Nazism. And it was deleted and I was censored, and ultimately, I mean, I was locked out of Twitter for a week because of that. And I had to delete the tweet in the end. The censorship remained. But, I mean, it's a very small example, really, relatively speaking, compared to people who have had their Twitter accounts deleted altogether, been banned from Twitter, been banned from YouTube. And we hear this kind of uncritical McCarthyism where you're supposed to support NATO uncritically, let alone oppose it. Even in the Labour Party, as Camila mentioned, even in the left of the Labour Party seems to have abandoned this struggle that NATO is something that should be criticised and opposed. Even some on the Labour left are saying that NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO has never been a defensive alliance. And I think it's important to, educate ourselves about the reality of NATO and to remind ourselves about the reality of NATO. And on that topic, I wrote a series of articles for my Substack, which about something called Operation Gladio, which hopefully a lot of you will have already have heard of. But if you haven't, I mean, you can check out these articles on my Substack, asawinstanley.substack.com, about Gladio, which was a series during the Cold War. NATO ran a terrorist army, which was it was a network of terrorist groups all over Western Europe, all over the whole of Europe, really, which were, far right, stacked by the far right. And this is really something that is, I think, important for us to remind ourselves about if we already know about it, and to educate ourselves about. Because I think what Operation Gladio shows is that, that NATO has never been a defensive alliance. It's always been about going on the offensive. So these series of terrorist armies, Operation Gladio, most famous, there's a lot of details, and it's a really kind of unbelievable story where, for example, in Italy, the deep state, the Italian deep state, worked with former Mussolini fascists to attack the population in order to keep the left out of power, to keep the Communist Party out of power. And this was done under the auspices of NATO, and it happened all over Western Europe. It was a way to keep. It was when it was finally exposed in 1990. It was something that was said to be. It was justified as a defensive operation. It was never a defensive operation. NATO is not a defensive alliance, and I think that's really important to emphasize. The relations of NATO to the left have always been, incredibly negative. It's always been something that the whole point of NATO is to keep the popular movements out of power. And it's important that we, oppose NATO in that respect, I think. And so, when we see these kind of, when we see the weaker parts of the left saying that NATO is a defensive alliance, I think it's important that we stand against that and we remind ourselves that that is just simply not the case. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Asa. Fascinating. I remember when I first read about Operation Gladio, it was one of those deeply eye-opening accounts. It almost sounds like a strange conspiracy theory, but I'd urge everyone to look into it because it highlights the extent to which NATO powers actually oppose democracy and plurality via these, what they describe as stay-behind armies and groups who actually undermine and destroy, as Asa described it, popular movements. It's also worth quickly saying that it's quite striking that many Western outlets have, since 2014, documented the extent and influence of far-right and neo-Nazi groups, yet they now say they don't exist and it's just Russian disinformation. And it's worth just making the remark that by their own logic, it means that the BBC, New York Times, etc., have themselves, if you cite one of their articles, engaged in Russian disinformation. Such is the absurdity of the current climate. Moving on now to Anna Chen, who's a writer, poet, and broadcaster. The floor is now yours. You're just muted, Anna.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. No Cold War is about the only home I feel like I have during this period. I'm going to come at the subject of Ukraine from an oblique angle because it feels like this war is the penultimate step towards a world war. So if we look back long ago when China explored the world in the 15th century and reached as far as East Africa, they traded a bit and they brought back a giraffe. So the same century when Europeans landed in the Americas in 1492, they killed and enslaved its native peoples, stole their treasures and gave them smallpox blankets in an early form of biological warfare. In North America, 100 million Native Americans were killed. Black Africans were put through slavery, Jim Crow, and imprisonment. The USA was literally built on an ancient Indian burial ground because that's what they'd turned it into. And that's pretty much been the template ever since. Europeans sailed beyond their own lands for conquest, glory, and fortune. The Chinese mostly stayed at home. The Chinese invented gunpowder for great firework displays. Europeans turned gunpowder into murderous weapons of conquest. So if China is the newly rich kid wearing a Rolex who's wandered onto mafia turf and is about to get rolled, then America is the 300-pound ex-champ who's geriatric and punch drunk from all those fights. He's pinned the kid against a wall, fist in his face, screaming blue murder that the kid's about to hit him. Australia and Britain, the ugly sisters of the peace, and they nod enthusiastically and use the opportunity to bury bad news like hard no-deal Brexit fallout, a wrecked economy, excess COVID deaths, and a society that's breaking down. There were 17,000 gunshot killings in the first 6 months of the year, I was reading today, and that's, of course, you know, with today's latest shooting spree in Texas. So Asian people are scapegoated, attacked and killed, all whipped up by the crudest anti-Chinese racism that's lain dormant as an inserted yellow peril memory. And that's now being triggered at every level by the fourth estate of the state, the mainstream media. On top of the $750 billion a year spend on military preparation for attacking China, Biden has slapped a $500 million a year propaganda bounty on China's head. And you can take an educated guess as to which world leaders and their associates are flocking to get some of that. It's clearly having a profound effect on our collective sanity. Only a few days ago in Bristol, the Sims family were burnt out of their home in an arson attack. So I hope people please give support. That's on my Twitter details there. And that's about where we are right now. Sometimes it feels like we're living in the fall of the Roman Empire with technology, and sometimes it's the 1930s, and someone is doing their best to pin the blood libel on the Chinese. It was only 4 years ago that Christine Lagarde had pointed out the global economy was advancing in sync for the first time. Oh joy, we might never need war again. But of course, the plutocrats and the industry giants of the West don't just hold the delusion of conquest of China as the end game. They're also ridding themselves of surplus labor, which is, of course, us. Pampered middle and working class Westerners of the post-war liberal era who never had it so good are now being hollowed out and presented with the bill. So how did we get from the global economy running in sync and relative peace to the West's race towards a war on the fat, juicy prize that is China? The Anglosphere's propaganda wars rely on the public not joining the dots. Events are presented as mysterious, disjointed acts of the cosmos without cause or effect. Never forget the Battle of Orgreave, 18th of June, 1984, which rehearsed and revealed the depth of manipulation by the state. Thousands of striking coal miners were picketing the British steel coking plant. The day erupted in violent clashes between the miners and the heavy police presence, many of whom were on horseback. The news bulletins that night showed the miners attacking the police, who seemingly horse-charged them in response. Quite reasonable, you'd think, and this elicited public sympathy for the cops and outrage towards the miners. However, when the original film was examined, it emerged that they'd shown the news footage in reverse order, reversing cause and effect. They cut up the narrative, respliced it, started it at Act 2, slashed the backstory entirely, recast heroes as villains and villains as heroes. Attackers became victims and victims attackers. In the same way, the 8 years of war on Russian speakers in Ukraine ever since the violent coup in 2014 is disappeared like magic. So please just remember that operational template. So I just want to go through a short 21st century timeline of the march to World War III. So George W. Bush designates China a competitor in his 2000 election and in 2005 when he's standing in the rubble of Iraq. China begins to buy US debt in 2000. In 2006, the value of the US dollar falls by a third because of Iraq war inflation. Meantime, an alarming housing bubble is being pumped up. When China complains about the loss of their investment, the US tells them to suck it up. 2 years later, America's economic shenanigans lead to a breakdown of their system with the financial meltdown in the US Great Crash of 2008. A global depression is feared. China steps in to act as a shock absorber and rescues the world economy by allowing global currencies to devalue against the yuan, taking a massive economic hit themselves. They buy even more huge amounts of US debt until China holds over $1 trillion, and they stimulate domestic consumption because 1.4 billion Chinese can buy a lot of goods. So China saves the world economy from devastation. And so how is China thanked for this? In October 2011, only 3 years after China saves us all from America's great crash, Hillary Clinton, Obama's Secretary of State, writes her notorious piece urging the US to take control of the Western Pacific, that's the South China Sea to us, and the Central Eurasia landmass. Now, 3 huge countries lie in a straight line across the landmass from Europe to Asia. They are from west to east: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, where we saw an attempted coup in January, and Mongolia, plus the little-known region of China that was once called Xinjiang in ancient times, and it's now known as Xinjiang. This is China's backdoor into Central Asia and Europe. Taiwan, by the way, claims Mongolia as part of China. So be careful what you wish for, and let's hope President Tsai isn't made empress of all the Chinas, as the USA seems to want. The title of Hillary's piece is America's Pacific Century, and it basically lays out the aims of the project for the new American century. Hillary writes, there should be no doubt that America has the capacity to secure and sustain our global leadership in this century as we did in the last. The future of politics will be decided in Asia, not Afghanistan or Iraq, and the United States will be right at the center of the action. A year later, 2012, President Obama pivots to Asia, removing the US military from the Middle East and pouring it into Asia, where America has about 400 bases surrounding China already. So by doing so, America takes the first step in existentially threatening China. 2013, Australia and the US practice war on China in the Talisman Sabre, involving tens of thousands of troops. 2014, the US and Philippines begin annual military exercises over the pretext of disputed islands and shoals. In fact, Philippines and China are getting on quite well now. It's a local difficulty and they are going to have to work it out between themselves. Vietnam had already started militarizing their reclaimed islands back in the 1970s. In 2015, Xi offers Obama that he won't militarize China's reclaimed islands if the US stops threatening them. Obama's response is to sail the US fleet of warships straight into the South China Sea. He holds military exercises in the Malacca Strait between Indonesia and Malaysia, threatening to fence in China. By the way, 80% of South China Sea traffic is, of course, China sending us their goods. Donald Trump is elected in 2016, partly in fear of Hillary's enthusiasm for World War. Trump launches a trade war on China on spurious grounds. He claims a huge deficit, but when you factor in the American corporate giants providing sales and services inside China, like Apple, Microsoft, McDonald's, Nike, Coke, and Starbucks, the deficit is actually a surplus of about 24 billion. Around the same time as Trump's trade war, there's a slew of Thucydides trap articles warning us not to have a war just because Athens is catching up with Sparta. China negotiates trade in good faith, but refuses to buckle.
Sorry, Anna, just to say one more minute.
I'm getting to that point. Okay, I'm going to tie this up. Basically, faced by a China that's stronger than he expected, by summer 2019, Trump has closed the White House pandemic team and the CDC office in Beijing. And I'll just finish by saying that coincidentally, Boris Johnson ascends to the Downing Street premiership that summer. And you know what one of the first things is that he does? He closes the British pandemic team. This is also in July 2019. I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure that everyone can join up the dots and work out what's been happening. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. As ever, merging characteristic literary impulses with incisive political insights to great effect. Brilliantly joining the geopolitical dots. And I think it's important to understand this conflict in terms of NATO and US attempts to undermine the Russia-China comprehensive strategic relationship. Moving on now to Kayla Quesada, who's an academic and geopolitical analyst based in the US. The floor is now yours.
Hello, thank you. And thank you to No Cold War Britain for inviting me. My name is Kayla Quesada, and I am from the US Friends of the Soviet People. Now, some of you there may be asking, the Soviet people, the USSR doesn't exist anymore. No, the USSR doesn't exist, but Soviet people still do, and they still consider themselves Soviet. We were formed in 1927 from various pro-Bolshevik and anti-imperialist groups and worked until 1991 when operations were ceased due to the counter-revolution in the USSR. But we ultimately restarted again in 2001, where we continue to grow and uplift anti-fascist forces in the post-Soviet countries. But to get onto the topic, I want to address one thing off the bat. Media, education, politics, they have all reduced Nazism to this phenomena that birthed in Germany and is reduced to just violent anti-Semitism. The German fascists, the Italian fascists, the Romanian fascists, the Spanish fascists, they all identified as fascists and they all fell under the umbrella of fascism. But they were the fascists that had state power, but fascism was on the rise all over the European and American continents, and Ukraine was no exception. So what we're talking about and seeing unfold in Ukraine today is National Socialism, a type of fascism, which is a misnomer in its name, as it has socialism in its name, but it's a polar opposite ideology. But National Socialism is rather nationalism that becomes the social and political rule of the land. And it is corporatist, as the Ukrainian Nazis called it themselves. So the Ukrainian Nazis of 1940 and of today are no less fascist than Hitler was, solely because they're not German. The fact of the matter is, after World War II, which we celebrate as the defeat of fascism, the members of the Ukrainian National Socialist groups never disappeared, they never went away. They merely reoriented and passed on their ideology to younger generations through familial stories, books, education, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and their legacy and their myths were institutionalized underground in the USSR, but very blatantly here in the West. I may be the only person on this panel from the United States, but I am certainly not the only one aware that the CIA helped bring thousands of Ukrainian Nazis and gave them positions as heads of nonprofits and news agencies like Radio Free Europe and so forth, trying to cultivate this Ukrainian American civil society that was headed by literal fascists that slaughtered over 150,000 Ukrainian Jews, Poles, and Romas during World War II. And this was all done in the US for the sake of winning the Cold War. But who really wins when fascists have power? Certainly not us. The United States brought in war criminal Nazis to help the US destabilize the Soviet Union. For example, like Mykola Lebed, who was one of the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. When he came to the US, he got a position in the Prologue Research Corporation that created research and policy initiatives on Ukraine, on US and Ukraine relations. So Lebed was known even by the Germans to be especially murderous and tortured people to death for fun. This is what the Germans said about him. But when he arrived in New York City, he was then paid by the US government an equivalent of $91,000 a year to create propaganda and organize regime change in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now you may be wondering, how did they escape the Soviet authorities, the Nuremberg trials? How did they even make it to the West? Well, they came from displaced person camps in Germany, where US intelligence reports that were recently released reveal that 80% of the Ukrainians from the West in the displaced, so Western Ukraine, in displaced persons camps remained loyal to Stepan Bandera. And that's talking about all the people. That's talking about the civilians as well. So Stepan Bandera was the leader of the most violent and radical wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And it was his group that committed the Babi Yar massacre, which was one of the most prolific massacres which was the prolific massacre during the Holocaust, which was in Kiev. But the US was not the only country that helped immigrate Ukrainian Nazis. No, they made it to Canada and Western Europe too. The Simon Wiesenthal Center estimates that 2,000 of the Ukrainians that immigrated to Canada between 1947 and 1957 were Ukrainian Nazis and Nazi collaborators. So just to give some clarity, there were Ukrainian Nazis who did not want to work with the Germans after Yaroslav Stetsko and Stepan Bandera were arrested. And there was another faction that was still loyal to Hitler. Both of them were Ukrainian Nazis. All of them were still Ukrainian Nazis. Just some of them didn't want to collaborate with the Nazis after the arrest, and some did. And so again, these people, these Nazis and these Nazi collaborators, these people that murdered Jewish and communist and Polish people that wanted to create a fascist state in Ukraine, they went on to immigrate into Canada and Western Europe and the United States and created civil society groups. They created the League of Ukrainian Canadians that dominated and continued to dominate Western media reports on Ukraine. Let's talk about Chrystia Freeland, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada. Her own grandfather, named Michael Chomyak, was a Ukrainian Nazi and Nazi collaborator. Now, you can't pay for the crimes of your ancestors. We're not going to hold you accountable for that. But Freeland continues to support the legacy of her grandfather and Ukrainian Nazis to this day. So as far as I'm concerned, Chrystia Freeland is also a Ukrainian nationalist. I have another name for you that I mentioned before, which is Yaroslav Stetsko. He was a Ukrainian Nazi that collaborated with the Germans when Operation Barbarossa commenced. So Operation Barbarossa was the operation in which Germany invaded Soviet territory. So think Ukraine and Belarus. And Stetsko declared a Ukrainian independent state because he was previously told that with allying with the Germans, that they would help him build an independent Ukrainian state. Well, he turned out to be getting played by the Germans. They weren't really interested in that. They were more interested in exterminating Slavic people. And so Yaroslav Stetsko and Stepan Bandera were then held prisoner for declaring independence in a concentration camp. But then they were released in 1944 by the Germans to aid in fighting the encroaching Soviet army. Stetsko later immigrated to Munich after World War II, and he created the anti-communist bloc of nations, which was active all over Europe, funded by European nations, and comprised of various fascist groups. And Stetsko later became the head of the OUNB abroad. The Svoboda Party in Ukraine uses his book, Two Revolutions, as their guiding ideology. This shows that the OUNB never died out. They never went away. OUNB members sit on the board right now of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, and their legacy still lives on in Ukrainian politics today. The Ukrainian National Socialism is alive and well, but it has mutated now as a facade of a liberal democracy, where underneath there is military rule with complete support from civil society groups, especially in the West, which are entrenched in Ukrainian nationalist socialism. But here in the West, in regards to Ukraine, this is the only opinion allowed. You either repeat the narrative of Ukrainian Nazis or you're an agent of Moscow. This is what Yaroslav Stetsko believed. This is what Yaroslav Stetsko said, and this is what our people are being told to believe today in Western media. So you see, there is a long history of Western cooperation and even advancement of Ukrainian Nazi propaganda that has become the only acceptable opinion to have. This has been in the works since the 1940s, and so it's no surprise as the West has clamped down on any alternative voices and perspectives, because there has been and continues to be monies and interest in furthering Ukrainian Nazism as a means to destabilize and bring Russia to its knees, of course at the Ukrainian people's expense. The more aggressively than the media manufacturing of consent during the Iraq War, this war on Russia via Ukraine has taken censorship into an overdrive. It's as if we were at war, because truthfully, we are at war. This war has been created hand in hand with Western politicians who have been funding Ukrainian Nazis since the 1940s, and those very Nazi groups who are leading their fascistic crusade of their 100-year war their political ancestors started in 1905. So we have to understand who created the Ukrainian diaspora civil society in Europe and North America, and who funded them. The Western governments have been in bed with Ukrainian Nazis for years, for decades, and this is their war. This is what NATO has started and been preparing for since the 40s. And we should be very concerned about how this war in Ukraine not only affects global markets and accessibility to resources for working class people abroad, but the growth of the European far right. Our leaders are giving billions of dollars without any oversight to one of Europe's most corrupt countries where the far right rules. I want to be clear that the existence of Nazism in Ukraine is not even just in the Nazi groups itself. Ukraine is a state where nationalism is the ruling ideology. And it doesn't matter how many millions fight it in Ukraine, they are killed or arrested by the military junta that dominates the country, like the Kononovich brothers. So from the Catholic Church to the Ukrainian education system with their national patriotic programs, to the dictatorship of financial capital, I'm confident to say that Ukraine is a Nazi state. Nationalism is the dictating ideology in Ukraine, where the opposition and leftist groups—
Sorry, Kayla, just another 30 seconds to a minute left.
It's been banned and arrested over the 8 years. If this was any socialist country, it would be called authoritarian, and Ukraine would have been sanctioned. And we must be concerned with the far right all over the world going into Ukraine and getting combat training, bringing this back to our home countries. So once again, we've reached the point where literal Nazis have hands on weapons and billions of aid, while only the anti-fascists are getting blacklisted and silenced. It's only a matter of time before the chickens come home to roost. And we should look to the history of Latin America as to what the US has been training and perfecting. This is the future for you Europeans.
Thanks so much, Kayla. Important historical context about the nature of the neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine and beyond, and how these groups were integrated into Western organizations. And again, I think it's worth mentioning, as with Asa's point about Operation Gladio, for many people in the West, it'll still be a surprise to learn about the extent of integration and rehabilitation of Nazis into NATO's structures. And it's important to understand the character, ideology and purpose of NATO in the context of this proxy war. Next up, we have Steve Sweeney, who is the international editor of the Morning Star, who's talking in a personal capacity. He's recently been in Ukraine, so it'll be interesting to get his insights. Just before we introduce him, a reminder that if you do have any questions, because we're going to have a Q&A session following Steve Sweeney's contribution, please use the Q&A function to submit them. Over to you, Steve. Oh, Steve's still muted.
Okay, thanks very much. Ukraine has now become the new caveat that is used to publish almost any story in the mainstream press, no matter how ridiculous the story, no matter how little evidence is presented. And we're seeing a stream of these kind of stories. Putin is dying of cancer, sources say. This is the one that's resurfaced again today. The Russian military is looking to oust him, despite him and the Russian intervention having mass popular support at home. 200 bodies found in Mariupol, Ukraine says. A story which has been parroted by most media outlets, despite there being no photographs of the mass grave and no indication of when or even where they were found. And this is, unlike any place that I have covered, for example, in Iraq, where I've seen evidence and I've seen the footage of mass graves. When I visited the Shabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon, it was very clear. You could see the evidence of these mass graves. And of course, the fact that these alleged killings could have been carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces doesn't cross the minds of Western journalists who are happy simply to believe Kiev unquestionably. Russian soldiers raped a one-day-old baby, Ukraine says, in news similar to one of the more ridiculous stories that was propagated during NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia, in which it was said then that Serbian soldiers were forcing women to have sex with dogs and then to give birth to half canine, half human babies. I mean, I kid you not, this was in the mainstream media as well. It made it, I think, into the Daily Mirror. But as was the case then, and it's the same case as now, it's to portray the Russians as barbarians, and it's to rally public support and consensus around the need for increased arms sales and the expansion of NATO. What we're seeing really at the moment is the most blatant and the biggest propaganda offensive I think I've ever seen. It's been years in the making. Other speakers have alluded to this, nurtured by the CIA, who have spent millions inside Ukraine on media operations as well, aimed at attaining a global consensus and controlling the narrative. And this has been made even easier now that RT has been banned. All media organizations inside Ukraine have been shut down except for one. The Ukrainian Communist Party has been banned. The Kononovich brothers jailed to absolute silence from the Western press and those so-called warriors for freedom and democracy. I'll come on to what happened to me, but let's just say it's no mistake that the likes of Paul Mason and his merry band are able to enter Ukraine freely, meet with people and organizations sanctioned by Kiev, and then come back to Britain to amplify every single imperialist talking point and try and force the Labour movement into adopting pro-NATO and pro-government positions. Do we really think that it's a coincidence that their demonstration, which saw them chanting "Arm, arm, arm Ukraine" on the streets of London, took place at the exact same time that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson went to meet Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev? And what a stark contrast, of course, that is to the Greek and Italian trade unions that have launched a general strike against increased NATO spending under the slogan, "Lower your guns, raise our wages." Again, these mass demonstrations, these mass strikes have been largely ignored by the Western press. Ukraine is not winning the war. This is a fantasy. And this is one that's becomes very clear when you're inside the country too. And if it was winning, why has the US agreed a record-shattering $40 billion in aid? Why would Zelensky be appearing at the World Economic Forum in Davos with his begging bowl? As journalists, it's our job to shine a light into dark places, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. But the truth matters. But in Ukraine, those that come close to exposing the truth find themselves at risk. Patrick Lancaster, who is reporting from the ground in the Donbass region, has been subjected to death threats. People encouraged to find him and kill him. The Canadian journalist Eva Bartlett, who is also reporting from the east, has been placed on a government kill list. Ukrainians are being asked to inform on those deemed to be pro-Russian. Lists of undesirables have been drawn up, full of communists, academics, journalists, and activists. Just a few weeks ago, Ukrainian opposition leader and journalist Anatoly Shary was arrested in a joint operation by the SBU and Spanish police, accused of high treason, charges which in Ukraine are often met with a bullet. And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of this case. It means that dissidents and critics of the Ukrainian government are not even safe in the countries in which they are seeking sanctuary, can be hunted down by an intelligence service that has been compared to Hitler's SS, an organization that has even shot dead one of its own peace negotiators. This is not an academic talking point. In 2014, the Italian photojournalist Angelo Roccelli was executed by the Ukrainian army, accused of collaboration with Russian separatists that were deemed to be terrorists, as they called them. And a photograph of him was found in the office of the compilers of this list with the word liquidated written across it. Now, before I left for Ukraine, an American journalist, a friend of mine, joked with me that my body was illegal in the country. I have a tattoo, by the way, of Marx, Engels and Lenin here. And of course, these symbols are banned throughout Ukraine. But his words that were spoken in jest turned out to be prophetic. I was accosted by Ukrainian forces who wanted to know my business. I was threatened with torture. I was threatened with execution. I was told I would never leave the country. Now, obviously, I did. I fled the country in fear of my life, and I managed to smuggle out in a group of Ukrainian refugees and kept very quiet. But let's just talk about what's happening inside Lviv, for example, which is where I was. It's an area that is full of fascists and mercenaries. Soldiers and weapons are flooding into the country using civilian transport networks. I saw it with my own eyes. A new white helmets has been established by a former Tory councillor and city banker who fought with the YPG in Syria, and he's established an organisation known as the Nightingale Squadron, which is chillingly named after a battalion in Ukraine responsible for the massacre of thousands of Jews. My coach was from Poland, was full of men in military fatigues and backpacks containing who knows what. A man sitting opposite me with a tattoo of a gun on his face. I mean, we shouldn't judge by appearances, but you know. But I met many people in Ukraine who told me stories that conflict with the Western narrative. Maria, a woman who lived outside Mariupol, showed me a photograph of her destroyed apartment block. Azov, she said, pointing at it. She went on to explain to me that her family said that they would be shot dead if they tried to leave the area, Mariupol, not by Russians, but by Ukrainians. And she said that they were being held as civilians, as hostages, and that the Azov had terrorized them for 8 years. She told me of forced disappearances of friends, fearing the deadly knock at the door in the middle of the night by the intelligence services, pitting neighbor against neighbor, fearing that they would be grassed up or informed on for some minor dispute from years ago. They said that they weren't afraid of Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers, they said, brought them food and water. Many from the region had actually fled to Russia where they felt safer, fearful of the west of the country, which they say doesn't like Russian speakers. They begged me to tell their story to the West. They're aware of the narrative that is being spun, the attempt to portray Ukraine's Nazi forces as heroes while ignoring the atrocities that they committed in the Donbass region over 8 years of war, not 3 months as the liberals want you to believe. They all want peace. This is very clear, that a peace that they hoped would be delivered by Zelensky, but a peace that is being denied to them by the US, by Britain, by the EU, and by NATO. They know what the war is about, US hegemony and the defense of a unipolar world, not targeting not just Russia, but China behind it, not to mention the supply of liquefied natural gas and Nord Stream 2. In other words, it's an imperialist war, a war which has seen the 8 largest arms companies invited into the Pentagon, asked to manufacture more arms, a war that aims to prop up the military-industrial complex, a proxy war in which Nazi forces are armed to the teeth by the West. They're used as NATO's battering ram in Ukraine, and to hell with the consequences and the blowback. It's a war that is also going badly for the West. crippling their economies, despite what they would have you believe. But you won't hear this from the likes of the BBC, who along with Channel 4, NBC, CNN, Sky News, The Times, The Telegraph, The Guardian, etc., are all producing identikit reports from Kiev.
Just 1 more minute, Steve, please.
Okay. In fact, the BBC excelled itself in March when presenter Ros Atkins gave a masterclass on fascism denial in a 9-minute documentary, in one of the shoddiest pieces of journalism I've seen. I don't have time to go into it now. I deconstructed this in an article for Al Mayadeen called Hurrah for the Azov, named after the infamous Daily Mail headline of the 1930s. I'll try and post it in the chat afterwards. But all I had when I entered Ukraine was a camera and a pen. Ironically, I would have been safer and more welcome if I had military fatigues and a gun with the intention of killing Russians. They would have rolled out the red carpet for me had I gone there as a pen wielder for imperialism. But I'll never compromise my journalism. I'm not for sale at any price. And the only solution really is to disband the NATO war machine. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. Frightening but important insights of what's not being reported in Ukraine and perspectives not heard in the West. They often say truth is the first casualty of war, but increasingly it seems that journalists are too themselves. Also kind of begs the question whether Ukraine can be described as the beacon of European freedom it is heralded as by NATO countries. Now we're going to move on to questions and answers session now. We've had a few questions, so we're not going to be able to put them all to the speakers, but we're going to provide a selection of questions and the speakers can respond to any questions they see fit. And if I can ask that speakers take 3 minutes, up to 3 minutes to respond, and we'll do it in the order that they spoke, although I think Camila may have left, so we'll do it in the order of the remaining speakers. So firstly, I'll just read out a few of them. What would be some things or approaches to hasten the downfall of the US and NATO influence on the world? Secondly, what are the scenarios to end this war? Russia win, Europe and USA win, or eventually they sit and talk? Also, if this war doesn't lead to a nuclear war, will a new world order be established? And finally, a couple more. What do you make of the argument that the West should arm Ukraine in order to defeat Russia? What impact does this have on helping or hindering peace? And there is lots of talk in the West about war crimes. Where does this leave Western leaders and their actions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and beyond? And I think that's probably all that we can fit in at the moment. Actually, we'll go one more. What can we do in the UK in relation to the Ukraine conflict and Britain's role? So we'll take Andrew first. So any of those questions and that you'd like to pick up on?
Thanks. I'm gonna respond to a couple of them by just pointing out a few additional things. Let's not forget that in the weeks leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, the chief executive of Raytheon, the second biggest arms company on the planet at that point, the biggest provider of bombs and missiles into the Yemen conflict to the Saudi and UAE-led coalition, on a call with shareholders of the company, said that the tensions in Eastern Europe, referring to the Ukraine, as well as the situation in the Middle East, referring primarily to Yemen and perhaps also to Palestine, are extremely good news for this company and for you, our shareholders. What he meant by that was simply that these conflicts meant greater revenues, greater profits for the company and all of those politicians, military and intelligence leaders, and others that their industry supports. What Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson refers to as the global national security elite. For these people, war is good news because war is big business. To change the nature of the world we live in, we need to overcome this extraordinary notion that entities like NATO, that our country's extreme defense spending is actually making the world a safer place. Even if one spoke very narrowly about national security as it is coined, that isn't the case, and in fact, the opposite is true. But if one looks more broadly at the concept of human security, the greatest threats facing us, I would argue, poverty and inequality, global health pandemics, and the climate catastrophe. And all that our spending on so-called defense and national security do is exacerbate all of those things. So I feel, as an investigative researcher, as a campaigner, as somebody who fought against a system of racist oligarchy in South Africa, that our responsibility is to put as much information as we can, as well sourced and verified as possible, into the public domain in as many creative ways as possible, and to communicate to people about the great lie that is spoken in many of our names in the Western world. So my solutions for the conflict in the Ukraine are unfortunately far broader than simply dealing with this conflict. My solutions would be to focus on diplomacy rather than conflict. But unfortunately, diplomacy makes no profit for anyone, and especially for no one in a position of power in this insane world we live in.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. Now over to Asa, please. If there's any points or questions you wanted to pick up on.
I'm just going to very briefly reply to the question. The questioner that stated, many in the anti-war movement use the demand Russia out of Ukraine, and what do the speakers think of that demand? I don't think much of the demand, to be honest, because I think it's quite vague, because I think you have to, I think it's better to talk about a negotiated settlement and for peace negotiations, because Russia out of Ukraine depends on your definition. Because, I mean, I saw one tweeter some months ago, even before the Russian intervention, stating, demanding, calling Eastern Ukraine Russian occupied. Well, who are the Russians that he's talking about? He's talking about Ukrainians of Russian descent, Ukrainian citizens who are, define themselves as Russian. So, who speak Russian, consider themselves perhaps ethnically Russian, who, broadly speaking, support the independent republics that were declared years ago now. And, as other panelists have pointed out, this war didn't just start in February. There's far deeper problems that have been boiling over, and at least 12,000 people died in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, before, long before this war started. So, I mean, I think Russia out of Ukraine, I don't think that's a particularly helpful demand.
Thank you very much, Asa. And over to Anna, please. Anna, you're still muted.
I have a question. I don't know if anyone has a question for me, but I just want to know, what do the NATO countries the applicants like Finland and Sweden. I mean, why? I just don't understand. I can understand that there are a few perverted characters at the top who would want to join NATO, but what is it that the people of those countries think they're getting? I would have thought after all these decades, they know they're not going to be invaded by Russia. And I'm just thinking, in all this time, is this what's been going on, that new generations are being made to forget that it's basically Russia that saved, or the Soviet Union that saved us all from Hitler and the Nazis. 27 million Russians killed, and that never gets mentioned. I just think that's obscene. So yeah, what is it they think they're going to get out of this, apart from aggro?
Thanks, Anna. Little spanner in the works and turning it by asking a question herself. Perhaps Kayla or Steve can offer an answer or to any of the previous questions mentioned. Kayla, over to you.
I want to answer the question about giving more money to Ukraine. So I went to Ukraine in 2019, and it was a very beautiful country full of nice people. I very much felt like home there. And so this is what I meant before, where the nationalism is kind of the ideology of the state, where most of the Ukrainian people are not going to be safe hailing or look like Nazis, but there's a nationalism that's been very much entrenched into their consciousness without a focus of it. And when I was in Kiev and Odessa, I saw some of the memorials of the war on Donbass, people that were killed from the Ukraine side on the war on Donbass. And I remember thinking to myself, I remember crying because I was thinking, what was this all for? I think that's when I had like a aha moment that this is all bullshit. This is all just for profit. This is all for Poroshenko's profits, and the Ukrainian people are suffering at this. The Donbass and Ukrainian people are being killed and turned against each other over the rich that are making money off of this war. That's the same thing that's going to happen if we continue to keep funding, and it's going to get progressively worse. I think Steve said it, which just makes so much sense, that they're building the new white helmets. They're building a new ISIS in Ukraine. This is just the Ukrainian far right that are killing their own people, that are, the military junta within the country. If we continue to fund Ukraine, if we continue on the path that Ukraine is at, not allowing them to make the peace negotiations, not allowing them to actually have sovereignty, because right now they're on the dime and on the leash of the West, but actually have sovereignty so that they can save their country, then it's going to turn into a failed state with the fascists with armed training spilling out into other countries. And it's going to be a colossal destruction for the European continent, for the US, because we have a lot of people who are training over there, far right nationalists training over there, that are going to come back. It's going to be a disaster. What we absolutely don't need to be doing is funding this war and continuing that Ukraine has no chance of winning, furthering Ukraine into a failed state. What they need to do is sign some peace negotiations. And also just to say, this whole Russia out of Ukraine, you're not looking at the right enemy. You're not looking at the real cause of this issue. It's not Russia. Russia did not start this war. I don't know if they invaded. It was NATO that started this war.
Thank you, Kayla. Important and in some respects frightening warning about some of the potential outcomes if we continue arming Ukraine. And finally, we have Steve Sweeney to pick up on any of the points or questions.
I guess the obvious thing is the one about arming Ukraine, and is that a good idea? The answer is obviously no. That's a recipe for disaster. It's not only expanding the war. This is a call for the death of more Ukrainians, the death of more Russians. So this is why it was absolutely horrific to see the Arm Ukraine demonstration on the streets of London. Largely, I have to say that it was rejected by the people. The turnout for it was absolutely pitiful. Again, we should be glad for that, which means that the people of Britain want to see an end to war. Quite naturally they want to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean support for NATO. And of course, the danger is that the arms that are flowing into Ukraine what happens to those once the war is ended, and it will end at some point, and it will end with a peaceful negotiation sat around a table, as all wars do. What happens to those arms then is the question. Those arms that are, are now in the hands of neo-Nazis, and that's the important thing to remember. The neo-Nazis that the BBC and others are desperately trying to either rebrand as heroic nationalists or downplaying their influence, but the BBC does that, but at the same time it seems to manage to find them for nearly every single news report. And as Asa said in his speech, we saw the NATO tweet that showed them with the black sun star. So I think that the other thing is that this issue around self-determination, and what is the outcome again? Well, the outcome was already on the table. Minsk too was already on the table, but the Russians the Ukrainians and the West just rode roughshod over it and ignored it, and this would have led to a better resolution with the autonomy for the people of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, inside as remaining as part of Ukraine. That's all that they wanted. But there was a path to war and a path to peace, and unfortunately, the West and NATO chose the latter, and the people of Ukraine are paying for it with their lives, and the people of Russia are paying for it with their lives, and the European economy is paying for it as well with this huge financial crisis. Italy sliding into recession. It's going to introduce a state of emergency. 500,000 jobs are going to be lost in Italy and in Germany as a result of the cutting off of Russian oil. So I think the demands must be for a negotiated solution, but it must also be for the disbanding of NATO. And that's what we should all be very clear on, this smashing this notion that NATO is a defensive alliance and it's an aggressive alliance. We all know that, but the how do we get from A to B? And the thing is, at the moment, the governments own the mass media. They're in positions of power, and those things can only shift if we start building our own strength and our own networks, and building a mass movement that actually pushes these things back. And I think that's absolutely essential. But while we're talking about respecting Ukrainian sovereignty, also respecting the same and the right of autonomy and self-determination for the people of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea as well. That's, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. Certainly not mincing your words, a strong way to conclude there. So we're coming up to 8:30 now. So I just want to say thank you to all the speakers for a timely, insightful and wide-ranging discussion on a defining geopolitical crisis of our time. As the conflict continues to unfold, we hope this discussion has shed light on key issues shaping people's understanding of events, and of course how they influence the path towards achieving a lasting peaceful settlement. But also to add, we have more upcoming events planned, you'll be delighted to know. So date for your diary, Wednesday 15th of June. And in the context of the upcoming NATO summit in June, we've got a great lineup of speakers discussing the theme of opposing the new age of US militarism, Britain's junior role in new threats to world peace. There should be more info in the chat, and also to stay up to date in relation to that event and future updates, you can follow us on Twitter. These should be in the chat, but I'll just repeat them quickly again. Twitter is @NCW Britain, Facebook @NoColdWarBritain, Instagram @NoColdWar_Britain. And again, this event is being uploaded onto YouTube, so it can also be viewed there afterwards. We tried to live stream it, but I understand there were a couple of issues, but it will, as I mentioned, be uploaded. So thank you again to all the speakers, organizers, and of course, our esteemed audience. Until next time. Take care, everyone.